Hi, I'm Lee Terry from The Middle Ground. The Middle Ground, or TMG, is the online people's think tank that promotes moderate, productive, and nonpartisan solutions to economic, social, and political problems.
And I'm Cynthia Smith from The Middle Ground. You can learn more about TMG at our website, themiddleground.org.
This is the fourth installment of our series on climate change. In this series, we are examining a number of potentially effective and practical responses to climate change, a problem that's getting much worse every day and threatens everyone on the planet. If you disagree with this premise, then this series is not for you.
Yes, we at The Middle Ground are in the practical alarmist category when it comes to climate change. If you think it's nothing to worry about, then you shouldn't bother watching. On the other hand, we do encourage viewers to participate in the search for solutions on TMG's website, the home of our online people's think tank.
We think climate change can be stopped and ultimately reversed by implementing a number of practical, realistic, and effective actions.
Roger that.
We've already discussed how we can promote the growth of two natural carbon sinks, regenerative farming and reforestation.
Those are both very promising natural methods of absorbing CO2 and other greenhouse gases from the air and putting the carbon back in the ground or in the trees where it belongs.
Now we get to talk about some proposals to use technology instead of nature to soak up those GHGs.
I guess we have to start in Iceland.
You don't have to look so downcast. It's actually a beautiful place that has never been covered with ice. It's Greenland that's covered with ice, at least for now.
Anyway, Iceland has developed the world's largest CO2 eating machine. Orca sucks carbon dioxide out of the air and turns it into rock.
Yes, Orca began sucking 40,000 tons of CO2 out of the air each year on September 21st, 2021.
Okay, so why are we not that excited about this?
Well, first of all, that amount of CO2 is the amount emitted annually by 870 automobiles. Secondly, the plant cost $15 million to build. And third, I'm more than a little concerned that it's impractical outside of Iceland.
Why is that?
Iceland uses geothermal energy to create its electricity, making its electric rates the cheapest in the world.
Oh yes, isn't that why all of the cryptocurrency miners moved there? To get the cheap electric power they need for their computers to solve the
Algorithm.
The algorithm?
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Okay, so $15 million and cheap electricity can cancel out the emissions of 870 cars. How many of these plants would we need to cancel out all the automobiles in the world?
Well, there are 1.4 billion cars on the road today, so that means we would need to build 1.6 million Orcas at a cost of about 2.4 quadrillion.
Okay, that's way too much, even in these crazy times. And has anyone tried to figure out how much energy would be required and carbon emissions would be produced just from building all these Orcas?
Yeah, it seems like you'd be digging yourself a pretty big hole just to cancel out 870 auto tailpipes per plant. And don't forget, while cars are the biggest source of GHG emissions, they are still less than a third of the total.
So let's just say that the technology behind Iceland's Orca is promising, but it's got a long way to go in terms of efficiency and cost effectiveness.
So how about some other carbon capture technologies?
Well, there are a number of initiatives worldwide trying to bury CO2 in the ground without turning it into rock.
Yeah, those suffer from the same problem as the Iceland's project. Lots of energy and greenhouse gas production to collect and bury the CO2.
I also don't really like the long-term prospects of burying the CO2 if it isn't going to materialize.
Mineralize. I am interested in the one where they use CO2 from the air to make jet fuel, however.
How does that work? Do we really need more jet fuel?
Well, according to an article in the online magazine Nature Communications, Because the CO2 is extracted from air and re-emitted from jets when the fuel is consumed in flight, the overall effect is a carbon-neutral fuel, at least when they use an iron-based catalyst in the combustion process.
In other words, since people are going to keep flying on jets, we're better off reusing the CO2 that's already in the air instead of taking it out of the ground.
Exactly. When you make fuel out of fossil sources like gasoline or coal, the combustion process unlocks the carbon that was in the ground and puts it in the air, where it causes climate change.
So this one is really good. If we use only synthetic fuels made from CO2 in the air, instead of using fossil fuels that pull carbon out of the ground, the article says that internal combustion engines would no longer contribute to climate change.
Yeah, the biggest obstacle here is going to be the political rather than the scientific or economic. It sounds like the science is there.
Still, I'm excited about that one. What else have you got?
Well, sticking with the jet fuel thing for a minute, there are a bunch of initiatives to use solar power to provide the energy for the CO2 recycling process. For example, a company in Tucson called Dimensional Energy uses the blazing desert sun to power electrolysis to create hydrogen from water and then mixes it with CO2 to make synthetic methane, which can then be turned into liquid fuels like jet fuel.
I like the term CO2 recycling. It makes it easier to understand.
So you know how NASA is trying to get a manned mission to Mars?
I remember reading about that.
Well, the atmosphere of Mars is like 90% CO2. So the agency NASA issued a carbon conversion technology challenge with big cash prizes for the winners.
Nice. That might also help us here on Earth, of course.
Well, it already is helping, I think. NASA's already patented new technology that converts CO2 into fuel by using solar-powered thin-film devices that might work on Mars, I guess, and is offering to license that technology to private firms here in the United States.
That is exciting. Maybe a lot of companies will take NASA up on it, and we will have some really great CO2 absorbing and converting technologies very soon.
So let's shift to another CO2 technology, but it's not entirely synthetic like the others we've been discussing.
What do you mean?
Well, do you remember the movie Ghostbusters and there was that green slime guy where the ghost covers him in green slime?
Yes, but I'm sure we're not going to use green slime to capture CO2.
Oh, yes, we are. Algae farming has the potential to suck up not only tons of CO2, but also use brackish water that's otherwise unusable and that won't sustain conventional crops. And trust me, this algae stuff is green and slimy.
And what, pray tell, are we going to do with all that slime?
I never thought you'd ask. Apparently, algae is extremely high in protein. So an algae farm would produce 10 times as much protein farm as a soybean farm of the same size.
Yuck. Who is going to eat that stuff?
You have no idea how much yucky stuff is already tucked into your health food bars and other processed foods. I admit that large-scale use of algae for human and even animal food is still a ways off, but the idea of algae farms using brackish water to gobble up CO2 from the atmosphere and generated by industry to make protein is probably a good long-term play.
I think I'll keep my money in cryptocurrency.
I hope you're kidding. Just don't put it into concrete production. Did you know that concrete production creates as much as 8% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions?
I had no idea, but I assume we will be covering that in a later episode.
Not exactly. That wasn't just a teaser. It was more of a cry for long overdue regulation of concrete production. You know where we are right now in this conversation, right?
Yes, it's time to talk about the best way to promote the use of some of the technology we've discussed. Now we need to go through our usual 4 alternatives of prohibition, mandates, regulation, and incentives.
Yes, let's do so. But we also need to recognize this is really all about political pragmatism.
How so?
Well, every one of these carbon-reducing and recycling technologies, if implemented, will diminish the oil and gas industry and, to a lesser extent, the coal industry.
All of them? Really?
Yeah, all of them. Right now, if we use hydrocarbons to produce energy. We pull those hydrocarbons out of the ground where they have been stored for thousands, if not millions of years, and we burn them, which releases the carbon stored in them into the atmosphere.
So whenever we burn oil, natural gas, or coal, we are reducing the amount of carbon stored in the ground and increasing the amount of carbon in the air?
Yes, and don't forget wood. That's stored carbon too. On the other hand, when we take CO2 and other greenhouse gases out of the air to make jet fuel or gasoline or other fuels, we don't need to drill oil and gas wells, dig up coal, or cut down trees.
But isn't there a big catch here? If it takes energy to suck the CO2 out of the air to make jet fuel or whatever, doesn't that require burning something which reduces stored carbon and scatters it in the air?
You are really smart. Seriously, that's a really smart question.
Flattery will get you everywhere.
Yeah, I know. So all carbon-eating technologies only work if they are net positive in terms of CO2 generation and CO2 consumption. And the easiest way to make that work out is to use only renewable energy to power them.
You mean solar, wind, and geothermal, right?
Yes, and other interesting ones like tidal energy, for example. Theoretically nuclear too, but that opens, a complete new can of worms. Look what happened in Ukraine with the nuclear.
So assuming these great CO2 recycling technologies can be made net positive in terms of CO2 reduction with or without renewable energy, they could put a lot of fossil fuel companies out of business. I'm having a hard time feeling sympathetic here.
I get it, but this is where the political realism we talked about earlier comes in. If we really want these technologies to get implemented and reduce GHGs, we need to get the fossil fuel companies on board and supportive of the technologies. If we don't, they will resist them to protect the trillions of dollars they have invested in oil and gas wells and coal mining properties.
How could they resist these technologies if they're so much better for the world?
Obviously, they will fight politically against anything that could hurt their bottom line. More nefariously, they could even use their trillions of dollars to buy the best technologies, patent them, and then never really use them instead of developing and applying them to save the world.
Really? Can they do that?
Yes, they can. It happens every day, and just not in such an important context.
It sounds evil. So how do you prevent that from happening?
It's not evil so much. It's just a method to protect your business and earn the maximum profits for your shareholders. Despite all those high-minded TV commercials from oil and gas companies about saving the climate, every business has the same singular ambition: make money for its shareholders.
So we have to find a way to make it more lucrative for fossil fuel companies to develop and implement carbon-consuming technology than to impede it, right?
Yeah, but you're going to find this even harder to swallow. You not only have to make it more lucrative to use the technology generally, you have to make it especially lucrative for fossil fuel companies to do so as opposed to someone else. We need to give the fossil fuel companies a head start, if not more.
Another special benefit for the bad guys, kind of like we talked about for fertilizer companies and their natural gas suppliers. Hey?
Yes, and there is already an interesting precedent for doing it. You probably heard of carbon tax credits. This idea would be similar, but also quite a bit different.
How would it work?
Well, governments could pay fossil fuel companies not to take any of their oil, gas, or coal out of the ground, but they only get those payments if and to the extent that they spend money on anything, and I mean anything, that is net positive in terms of carbon removal from the atmosphere.
What's the rationale?
Well, fossil fuel companies already have these trillions of dollars invested in the oil, gas, and coal that is, as of this moment, still in the ground. They currently plan to spend even more money to extract all that carbon from the earth and then sell it for a profit, net of what they paid to get it out. If the government pays them to keep that carbon in the ground, only if and to the extent they spend money on something else that removes carbon from the atmosphere, like carbon reducing technology we've been talking about, it's a win-win for everyone.
I see how it's a win for the oil companies, especially if they use CO2 out of the air to make jet fuel and gasoline. But how do we win?
We want to keep the oil and gas and coal in the ground instead of allowing that carbon to be spewed into the atmosphere. And while we're at it, we want to reduce the amount of GHGs already in the air, right?
Yes, but these guys are still going to be using the GHGs to make more fuel that will be burned and create CO2.
Probably, but the plan is to take more CO2 out of the air than we produce when the, quote, sustainable, close quote, fuel is burned. Remember, it's unrealistic to stop burning carbon-based fuels tomorrow or even in the next decade. We want to minimize the damage by discouraging the introduction of more carbon from fossil fuels that are still in the ground.
Still, you are essentially saying that we need to pay fossil fuel companies to stop destroying the world. Why don't we just pass a law prohibiting them from doing so?
Well, it'll never pass.
But laws creating financial incentives for them to leave fossil fuels in the ground might pass?
Well, yes, if there are no prohibitions on their conduct and we give them a unique and special opportunity to make more money without extracting fossil fuel assets still in the ground.
That's quite the incentive to innovate.
Look, prohibitions, or for that matter mandates, will never become law in time to save the world in this part. By the time we get the gumption to prohibit those incredibly rich and powerful oil and gas companies and coal companies from further extraction of carbon from the ground, it will be too late.
We need to find the path of least resistance and incentives to fossil fuel companies to leave oil in the ground while extracting CO2 from the air.
Could be that path. Well, look, this proposal isn't the only answer, of course, even if it were universally adopted, which it won't be, of course.
Of course, I guess this means it's pretty important to get going on regenerative farming and reforestation, isn't it? It doesn't look like carbon-consuming technology will be cleaning up the world all by itself, does it?
No, I don't think so. We definitely need to build up all of our important carbon sinks and protect those that might be threatened in the future, like peat bogs. Technological carbon eaters, even if they are more effective than the orca in Iceland, are not going to solve climate change by themselves.
Okay, you got me. What are peat bogs and why are they important carbon sinks?
Well, today there's actually more carbon stored in peat bogs or peatlands, like in Ireland, than there is in forests, farms, or grasslands. And when peatlands are disturbed, they can emit a lot of carbon into the atmosphere, making climate change much worse. So we really need to protect peatlands from development.
Well, that was cheery. Do you have any more good news for us today?
Well, not today, but next episode.
What's that one about? I hope it is strategies for reducing GHG emissions, finally.
Yes and no.
You're not capable of a straight yes or no answer.
Yes and no. Yes or no. What's the difference? Anyway, next time we are going to talk about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but we're going to approach it in a slightly different way.
How different?
Well, we'll be talking about ways to reduce energy consumption generally and thereby reduce GHG emissions. We're not going to spend a lot of time promoting renewable energy sources since that's already been covered elsewhere.
More like beaten to death, actually.
Yeah, we're trying to contribute something new here. On the other hand, we may just recycle some long forgotten ideas from the energy crisis of the 1980s, like turning off the lights and stuff.
What is once old is new again.
You are indeed a font of wisdom today. We are all the middle ground.